He was born blue, struggled to breathe, and ruled an empire in decay. By the time he died, his body was rotting from within, while the priests called it divine punishment. Charles II of Spain, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was a king in name, but a ruin in flesh. Born into a dynasty poisoned by generations of incest, his life was a spectacle of deformity, disease, and helplessness. He could barely speak, could not chew, and was too weak to rule. Yet the Spanish court clung to his existence, praying for a miracle, while his body slowly collapsed into a living corpse. His final days were not just a death, they were a revelation of dynastic hubris, a slow descent into rot, insanity, and whispered fears of the devil himself. The chamber was heavy with the scent of tallow smoke, sweat, and the iron tang of blood. Somewhere in the shadows, a midwife whispered prayers beneath her breath, her rosary slipping through trembling fingers. Outside the palace walls, bells tolled in anticipation, but within, the air had gone still, too still. Then a sound broke it, not a cry, not the healthy wail of a newborn, but a wet, rattling breath, shallow and sickly, like wind forced through torn cloth. Charles was born blue. Not the pink flush of life, but the bruised pallor of a child pulled back from death too soon. His head emerged misshapen, too large for his neck, crowned with a film of caul clinging like spider silk to his waxy skin. When the midwife lifted him, her hands recoiled before she caught herself. His eyes were unfocused, rolling, the pupils too large, and his tongue lolled from an open jaw that would never close properly again. "Bring the priest," someone whispered. The women present did not wait for protocol. The child could not suckle. He could not cry. His limbs dangled like twisted reeds, barely responsive to touch. The priest arrived running, his vestments half-wrapped, and performed the baptism at once, holy water splashing over a forehead already warm with fever. Carlos, he named him, and signed the cross with fingers that shook not from haste but fear. The queen, Mariana of Austria, lay silent and pale, her eyes searching the wet bundle swaddled in velvet and secrecy. She had birthed an heir, but not a future. In the following weeks, Charles II, newborn king-to-be, remained alive by stubborn accident. Nurses reported that he choked often in his sleep, that his head swelled, that his limbs twitched unpredictably. Some believed he was possessed. Others, that he was cursed. Behind palace doors, doctors murmured of the family tree, so gnarled, so incestuous, that it curled back on itself like a noose. His father's uncle had also been his grandfather. His mother had the same blood twice over. What came from this was not a child but a consequence. By the age of 4, Charles still could not speak. His voice, when it emerged, was slurred and thick, as if his own tongue were foreign to his mouth. His gait was unsure, first crawling on elbows, then propped up like a marionette, his legs bending at impossible angles. His spine, curved and stiff, pressed against the fine silk of his gowns, which were tailored wide to hide the grotesque proportions. His bones ached. His stomach distended. Sores formed where fabric touched flesh too long. Every Friday, they bled him. Thin wrists, pale as parchment, were pierced by fine silver blades. They applied leeches to his neck and arms, which swelled grotesquely before falling off, engorged and twitching. The physicians insisted it was for balance, to temper the royal humors, though some suspected they drained more than sickness, they drained what little strength he had. Servants avoided his eyes. One nurse claimed he looked at her in her sleep, though he hadn't left his bed. She asked to be dismissed. Another said she felt cold when he entered a room. Candles flickered when he passed. The palace grew superstitious. The boy king, still not yet crowned, had already become a silent specter, watched but untouched, a living relic of divine wrath. The court, desperate to maintain dignity, referred to him in documents as His Most Catholic Majesty. But behind doors bolted against rumor. He was simply called El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. And yet he lived. Not by strength. Not by providence. But by inertia, the slow, grinding movement of a dying house too proud to let its final sun slip into the dark without dragging the empire with him. Spain had a king. But what it saw, day by day, was a child dissolving into ruin. The hall was hushed, not with reverence, but with tightly coiled dread. The boy king was coming. Behind a wall of crimson velvet and polished gold stood a line of ministers and courtiers, powdered and perfumed, their eyes fixed on the gilded double doors that led from the royal chambers. Each man adjusted his stance, every breath held a fraction longer than natural, for all knew that what emerged next was not a monarch, but a walking prophecy of doom. Charles II, 14 years old, crowned in name, unfit in flesh, was led by the hand into court. His fingers, stiff with joint pain, barely curved around the guiding palm of his valet. He moved in a stuttering gait, legs dragging, one foot sweeping in a limp half-arc as if testing ground he had never learned to trust. Each step produced a soft wheeze, whether from his chest or his shoe no one could say. His head lolled slightly to the left, too heavy for his neck. His mouth hung open, jaw locked, lips wet from a string of pale saliva that glistened in the chandelier light before being wiped, again and again, by the trembling hand of a pageboy. He was dressed in the finest silks of Castile, but beneath the brocade and lace were layers of gauze soaked in balm to cushion the sores that bloomed across his thighs, hips, and back. Each movement ground fabric into ulcerated skin. By the time he reached the throne, a small patch of his chemise at the lower back had turned from white to ochre, soaked through with fluid that smelled faintly of vinegar and iron. A priest crossed himself quietly. The courtiers bowed low, more to avoid the sight than from loyalty. Some could not look at him directly. His eyes, uneven, glassy, drifted across the crowd without recognition. When he attempted to smile, his jaw cracked faintly, and one could see a twitch ripple down the side of his face, like pain reacting faster than the mind. He did not speak. Or rather, he tried. The sound that emerged was a wet, guttural murmur. The chamberlain, ever at his side, repeated the words for the room. No one questioned the substitution. They hadn't in years. He was fed before the ceremony, a paste of bread, milk, and honey pressed between the cheek and tongue. He could not chew, his molars were misaligned, one long dead and blackened. Twice that morning he had choked. Not fatally, not yet. But long enough that the attendants, trained in silence, exchanged pale glances as they slapped his back and wiped the tears from his reddened eyes. Once, a servant whispered that the king had stopped breathing for nearly a minute. No one recorded the moment. It would have been improper. In his chambers, the air was thick with decay disguised as piety. Relics hung like amulets from every bedpost, wooden crosses, saints' bones, dried flowers soaked in holy water and tied with gold thread. They reeked of mildew and stale incense. The mattress was damp, not with sweat alone, but with the residue of poultices, oils, and night's oil. Patches of it had been burned clean by vinegar. Underneath it all, the heavy stench of a body that refused to die cleanly. His confessor came nightly. The boy sometimes shrieked mid-prayer. He said there was a dog in the room, hairless, with human teeth, breathing beneath the bed. Other nights he insisted his tongue was missing. He begged them to find it. "Bring it back," he moaned once, clutching his own throat, "bring me back." Outside the chamber, the palace whispered. The maids washed twice after touching his linens. The kitchen staff refused to eat food prepared for his table. Guards rotated hourly to avoid the odor. Ministers debated whether divine favor had left the Habsburg line entirely. Still, Spain clung to its hollow sovereign, propping him up like a gilded corpse in a glass tomb, even as his flesh sagged from the bones and his soul, if it remained, was left to rot in the company of ghosts and saints who would not answer. The bells rang for union, but what entered the bridal chamber was not a man, and what remained behind was not a marriage. Marie-Louise of Orleans, barely 17, stepped from her carriage beneath the blazing Spanish sun with a hopeful tilt to her chin and a soft, trembling smile fixed tightly to her lips. Her gown shimmered like pearl in motion, her golden hair pinned in the French fashion, her youth radiant with the nervous anticipation of duty wrapped in silk. Behind her, the court murmured approval. Spain had a queen now. Spain had a womb. But in the gloom of the Escorial palace, where dust lingered in high beams and mold curled the edges of tapestries too sacred to remove, that hope began to wither before nightfall. Charles II was waiting. He stood motionless by the fireplace, a waxen shape in stiff brocade, already dressed for the bed he would not touch. His face, bloated and jaundiced, shone with the oil smeared across his skin to soften the chapping. His mouth hung slightly ajar. His eyes did not meet hers. One leg twitched as he tried to step forward, but his valet had to steady him. The room, heavy with incense and clove smoke, shuddered with the awkward scrape of his malformed boot against the stone. Marie-Louise curtsied. He grunted. They were left alone for the consummation. The doors closed with a groan of old hinges. Hours passed. No sound came. By morning, the queen emerged pale, her face unreadable, her steps hurried. The sheets remained untouched, no blood, no stains, no proof. The maids folded them anyway. In the days that followed, rumors swarmed like flies on fruit left too long in the sun. Did he attempt it? Did he understand what to do? Was the deformity of the body matched by one of the mind? One lady whispered of a useless organ, twisted, inert. A courtier claimed the queen had wept during confession. Another said she had refused communion. Charles said nothing. He sat, hands folded over his lap, eyes blinking slowly, his lips working at invisible words. At meals, he gurgled his food down in silence. When alone with Marie-Louise, he trembled, his limbs twitching uncontrollably, his mouth filling with spit he could not control. His breath reeked of milk turned sour. Once, in winter, his foot turned purple from poor circulation, and the queen fainted when she saw the skin peel away like wet parchment. The court turned on her. Whispers became indictments. She was cold. She was barren. She was cursed. Priests were summoned to bless her chamber. A physician brought from Naples swore he had seen signs of bewitchment, black threads in her bathwater, the odor of sulfur in her sheets. Another recommended bloodletting. She lost weight. Her hands shook. Her hair fell out in handfuls. At night she vomited bile the color of cold water. By the time she turned 26, her skin had gone yellow, her eyes sunken, her voice hoarse. When she died, suddenly, quietly, the kingdom wept not for its king, but for the queen it had crushed beneath the unbearable weight of an heirless throne. Charles, when told, blinked twice and muttered a prayer for her soul. He remarried within the year. Maria Anna of Neuburg was stronger. German, sharper. She came with a rosary in one hand and political instructions in the other. She was given laudanum to sleep through the first nights beside him. She reported, privately, to her confessor, that the king's limbs twitched in his dreams, that his skin was hot and slick with sweat, that his mouth opened and closed in animal spasms, emitting low, wet sobs like a child left in a dark room. He never touched her, not truly. She said his breath carried the stench of rotting onions and old milk. That his feet were wrapped in cloth to keep the nails from falling off. That he cried when the bells rang at dawn. Not for joy. Not for grief. But for something else. Something deeper. Something too broken to name. By his 32nd year, Charles II no longer resembled a man, but a collapsing structure held together by fever, prayer, and royal stubbornness. He could not stand. He could not dress. He could not even be turned in bed without the aid of 3 attendants and a whispered Ave Maria. His legs, swollen with trapped fluid, glistened beneath gauze soaked in pus and vinegar, the skin stretched tight and hot, then suddenly softening as ulcers split open, spraying black fluid onto the linens and the hands of trembling doctors who dared not meet one another's eyes. What they drained, they replaced with prayers. Every morning began with the peeling of cloth from wounds that had adhered to the bandages during the night, the rip producing a sound not unlike parchment tearing, followed by a sigh from the king that barely stirred the air. He no longer screamed, his throat too dry, his will too frayed. His skin, once powder-covered and presented to courtiers as pale nobility, now took on a yellow-gray hue that darkened at the fingertips and around the eyes, where veins pulsed faintly beneath the translucent flesh like worms beneath a pane of ice. The room never smelled clean. Not once. No matter how many candles were burned, how many pans of rosemary water were placed beneath the bed, or how many bowls of vinegar were left beneath icons of the saints, there remained a core of rot in the air, a warm, animal stench mixed with the metallic tang of blood and the damp, sour perfume of dying skin. It coated the lungs. Servants carried handkerchiefs perfumed with clove. Priests anointed the doorframes. The surgeons came daily, each arrival marked not by announcement, but by the dull rattle of trays bearing knives, retractors, and porcelain cups. They lanced abscesses that bled without clotting, dug into pustules that screamed with infection, and packed open wounds with rags soaked in turpentine or wine. On one occasion, they attempted to remove a necrotic patch near the lower back. What they found beneath, they did not describe aloud. One vomited afterward in the corridor. Another confessed. The third asked for coin in advance and did not return. His gums bled when he smiled, which was rare. His teeth loosened one by one, hanging in his mouth like chipped stones until they slipped free with no fanfare, swallowed or spat into cloths depending on the moment. His meals were slop, bread mashed with broth, boiled rice and milk, wine thickened with honey, and even these had to be coaxed down, for his swallowing reflex had begun to fail. Twice, he nearly drowned in his own supper. Flies gathered when he was moved. Slowly, almost politely. Drawn to the sour liquid pooling in bandages, to the heat of fever that seemed to vibrate off his chest. Courtiers stood far from his chair, masks of duty carved onto faces pale with dread. The queen used handkerchiefs dipped in lavender to press over her nose. Even the palace dogs refused to approach his lap, snarling softly and retreating when beckoned. He saw things in the dark. Not dreams, visions. His mother, standing at the edge of the bed, her lips sewn shut, her hands clutching a rosary of teeth. A man made of smoke who crawled across the ceiling and whispered his name in reverse. A shadow that stood behind the bishop, moving its fingers in rhythm with the prayers. Once, he screamed for an hour that there were insects in his skin, under it, chewing. The physicians bled him. The priests exorcised him. The alchemists burned sulfur beneath his pillow. In the rare moments he could form sentences, he asked one question again and again, each time quieter, as though he feared the answer might finally come. Why was I born? No one replied. By autumn of 1699, the king no longer rose from bed. He no longer turned his head when addressed, no longer blinked with purpose, no longer responded to his name unless it was shouted. His body, once bloated with fever and fluid, had thinned to a husk, limbs drawn tight over bone, skin yellowed and splitting like old parchment, his belly swollen from gas and internal bleeding, while the rest of him collapsed inward as if the soul had already fled and the flesh was folding in to follow. He lay like a relic, half wrapped in linen and sweat, breathing in short, wet rasps that smelled faintly of vinegar and wax. The palace floor outside his bedchamber was sanded twice a day to soak up spills, blood, bile, and worse. The windows were kept shuttered not for warmth, but to keep the flies from gathering at the corners of his mouth, where spit collected in thick yellow ropes. The candles burned at all hours. So did the prayers. He believed they were trying to kill him. Each time a meal was brought, usually broth thickened with mashed bread or sugared milk gone sour, he demanded that the priest bless it in full view. He watched the wine cup for bubbles, the bread for worms. He refused water unless it came sealed from the monastery. Once, when offered meat, he flung it to the floor and sobbed until his own nose began to bleed. He accused his wife. He accused the doctors. Then the French. Then the devil. Then his mother. Bring her, he whispered one night, to no one in particular. Bring her to me, I'll be good. His hair fell in clumps onto the pillows. The sheets were changed daily, yet the mattress beneath was soaked with years of illness, the stench of which no spice or incense could conquer. When they tried to lift him, his shoulder dislocated with a sickening pop, he didn't even cry out, only looked to the ceiling with hollow, lidless eyes. When they propped him upright to change his linens, black blood wept from his ears and nose, thin as ink and sticky as glue. The tongue had turned black by November. It no longer fit within his mouth. The physicians said nothing. The priests, now stationed in rotating shifts, began the final prayers a full week before the last breath. Some believed he had already died, and what remained was a vessel possessed. The rosaries clacked against wooden crosses as 3 friars performed a whispered exorcism, salt rubbed on his temples, oil on the feet, a crucifix laid on the sternum of a chest that no longer rose evenly. The court said he was improving. They issued notices of slight recoveries, fever broken, appetite returning, the king in good spirits. Meanwhile, the queen sobbed behind embroidered fans. Ministers plotted inheritance behind drapes. The embassies prepared for war. One morning, his fingernails came off in the linens. All 10. The flesh beneath was raw and white, like peeled grapes left in vinegar. He could no longer hold a spoon. No one tried to feed him. They whispered the final rites again, this time aloud. No one interrupted. And then came the final night. The room was heavy with a silence that did not belong to sleep. His legs twitched, once. His throat made a high, animal sound, somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. His eyes rolled upward. The breath caught. He convulsed once, shoulders lifting an inch from the bed, then settled. No scream. No light. No voice from heaven. Just stillness. And then, nothing. No great bell was rung. No angel descended. No wind stirred the dying wax of the candle stubs at the window. Only silence. The kind of silence that settles over a grave before the soil has cooled. The kind of silence that signals not just death, but judgment. The last of the Habsburgs was dead. And the empire that bore him now waited to see what would rot next. The body was barely cold when the knives were drawn. The ritual of royal death, normally solemn, veiled in incense and Latin, was hastily replaced with silence, with gloves pulled tighter, scalpels sharpened not in reverence but in dread. Charles II, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, lay stiff on the marble slab of the Escorial's makeshift post-mortem chamber, his head wrapped in linen to contain the stench, his tongue bloated and protruding from lips that would not close even in death. Outside, bells tolled mechanically, without emotion, their sound echoing through corridors that stank of wax and sweat. Inside, the men approached his body as one approaches the cursed or the condemned, with crosses under their breath and blades in their shaking hands. They began at the chest. The flesh gave way too easily, collapsing beneath the blade like rotted fruit, the subcutaneous fat thin, rancid, and gray. Beneath the sternum, they found the lungs first, putrid, sponge-like masses slick with a foul-smelling brown fluid that pooled on the tiles as it leaked from the incisions. The stench forced two of the younger attendants to gag and stagger back. The physician leading the examination, a court surgeon from Naples, pressed a cloth to his face and made the sign of the cross before continuing. The heart was next. It was black. Not merely dark from blood or decomposition, but blackened entirely, shriveled, dense, and hard as tallow left too long by the fire. It was half the size it should have been. Some present whispered it had been eaten from within. A friar muttered that it had never beat with grace to begin with. The liver crumbled at touch. The kidneys had fused to surrounding tissues. The intestines, when uncoiled, revealed knots of parasites curled within the folds, fat, pale worms glistening as they wriggled toward the candlelight before being flung to the stone floor and crushed underfoot. But it was the head that ended the silence. When they opened the skull, carefully, with trembling fingers, they found it not filled with the firm, folded gray of the living brain, but with fluid. Thick, pale, and foul. It spilled across the table and onto the surgeon's apron. Hydrocephalus, he whispered, but no one acknowledged him. The chamber had grown still again. A hush hung over the dissection table, not out of respect, but fear. The body before them was not simply dead. It was emptied. One physician would later write, in a private letter to Rome, that no blood was found within the corpse. The veins were dry, he recorded. The tongue black, the chest collapsed. The flesh corrupt. It was not a man, but a shell. A curse made flesh. The priests who had watched the procedure turned pale and refused to speak during vespers. One locked himself in his cell for 3 days. Another left Madrid that same evening and never returned to court service. The body was embalmed hastily, wrongly, and collapsed during transport to its tomb, leaking fluids through the coffin seams. The mourners kept distance. No one touched the bier. And yet, even before the tomb was sealed, the world had already begun to burn. Within weeks, envoys were summoned, treaties revoked, borders redrawn. The War of the Spanish Succession ignited as rival claimants tore at the corpse of an empire already rotting from within. France, Austria, England, all circled like carrion birds over what Charles had left behind: no heir, no future, no blood fit to rule. In the streets of Castile, the peasants whispered what the ministers would not say aloud: that the Queen had birthed a monster, that God had turned his face, and that Spain had paid for its pride not in gold or glory, but in the shriveled, stinking ruin of a boy called king. The Habsburg line ended not in glory, but in rot. In Charles II's wasted frame, in his twitching limbs, in the worms and water and blackened heart, the people saw not a death, but a prophecy fulfilled. The death of Charles II in 1699 marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and plunged Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession. As nations fought for control of the crown he could not preserve, Spain was torn between decay and rebirth, its nobility scrambling to survive a world without divine legitimacy. For centuries, Charles remained a symbol of the dangers of incest, the cruelty of dynastic obsession, and the terrible spectacle of a man crowned too soon, whose body broke under the weight of centuries of pride. His legacy is not one of power, but of warning.